Yeah, and I will say, when people ask about doing hard things in sport, and my nickname's the Queen of Pain, and like I really do some crazy hard stuff. But quite honestly, all of that, chosen pain and suffering is the training ground for when we get to the true trauma that's going to happen in all of our lives, losing a loved one, getting an injury, or whatever. All of that, those 30 years of being out in the wilderness, navigating, getting lost, falling down, getting hurt, those were the practice times. That was the playing field for me to practice the skills for the concussion that came 3 years ago, and the really sort of bigger trauma.
Hello, welcome to Brainstoke. I'm Tom Telford here with Preston Niederhauser. We are in studio today. This episode is brought to you by Levo, a mind care company. We also want to thank Bolt Shave. Thank you, Adam Barker, for incredibly savvy, smooth legs. So great the product that he's created. But we're excited to be in studio today with, frankly, a legend, someone who, we joked prior to hitting record that we stalk online because her journey, her career, her success has been nothing short of incredible. So, Rebecca Rusch, welcome. Want to make sure I pronounce that correctly?
It's Rush. It's easy to
It
remember.
is Rush.
Yeah.
Cool. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited. Stoked to talk to you about
Good.
this.
Right on. Rebecca, usually we start this podcast and we ask some type of silly question to kind of kick things off. But I think instead of doing that, I want to give all of our listeners a little bit of perspective on who you are and really talk a little bit about your accomplishments. And then I'll ask you a question at the end here. But just to give everyone an idea, Rebecca is a 7-time world champ. She's in the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame. She's in the Gravel Cycling Hall of Fame. She's one of the 50 most influential cyclists in the world. She summited Kilimanjaro by bike. She swam the Grand Canyon for 18 days in winter. She is a 2-time finisher of the Iditarod 350 by bike, I believe. 24-hour mountain bike world champ, a cross-country skiing world champ. She is the gravel world champ. I'm not done, everybody. She is 4-time winner of Leadville, which is a record. As I looked at all of her accomplishments, I counted over 60 different accomplishments that any professional cyclist would love to do just once, and their career would be made. So to understand how talented Rebecca is, and then on top of all of it, she's decided to go win an Emmy. Like, oh, what the heck? I'm going to be an Emmy award winner as well. So you've done some amazing things. My question is, and it doesn't have to be on the list I just created, but of all these accomplishments in your life, what one means the most to you?
Well, thank you. That it's always funny to go back through memory lane. And you listed all the cycling accolades, and really that's kind of the second half of my career. What a lot of people don't know is I started as a runner in high school. It was really impactful for me as a young girl to find cross country running as a sport. It changed my life, and we can get into that a little later. But I've done a lot of things, and I think the two things I'm most proud of, one is the longevity and the adaptability to stay at the elite level of sport, to keep doing what I love to do for 3 decades, and counting. So I'm proud of that, the longevity of it. And the ride, the expedition I'm most proud of that wasn't mentioned there was, well, you alluded to it with the foam, was riding the length of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and I went to do that expedition in search for the place where my dad died during the Vietnam American conflict. So that was one of my first really big expeditions that was personally just more emotional, I guess, than going and winning Leadville or going and doing these other hard challenges. It was a really dual purpose trip to, yes, want to be the first to ride the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but second to like really start an internal and an external journey at the same time. So that was a really pivotal moment in my sports career, was kind of the start of that internal introspective journey that we all know comes with endurance sports, but this one was quite intentional in that way.
Was that how long ago was let's see, is it called Blood Road? Blood Road?
Blood Road is the film that we did on that ride, the Emmy Award winning film. And we did the ride. This March will be the 10-year anniversary of doing the ride. And the film came out a couple years after that. So
Was that
2015.
was that a transition point of your career where you weren't you were in the spot where you were no longer chasing podiums and now you were seeking adventure and clarity and understanding about maybe life?
Yeah, that's a really intuitive. It was absolutely about a decade ago, a 10-year transition that is still kind of ongoing, but shifting from, me wanting to stand at the top of the podium versus, yeah, I still want to challenge myself, but I also want to bring other people along. And that's where I launched the foundation, the Be Good Foundation, and, started fundraising on my bike rides and adventures and expeditions. But yeah, the real shift happened with Blood Road and doing that ride and really kind of I feel like my dad showed me that the bike and my adventures and storytelling could impact other people and help other people. I feel like my dad taught me that on that trail. So was a real big shift in my career. Maybe not from the outside, but from the inside and the intention of why I do what I do.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I want to double click on this very thing, this internal versus external, external versus internal. And if you don't mind, go back to your childhood, because as I've listened and kind of followed along, I'm intrigued to know, what is it that drives someone to accomplish this long list of things that you've done over the years? Can you speak to your childhood and background a little bit as you reflect back on what was going on internally inside you that drove this scaffolding of an incredible life of accomplishment?
Yeah, that's a really good, it's an intuitive question. And yeah, we all have internal and external motivators. They change throughout our lifetime. But I definitely, through a lot of this reflection that's been happening in the last decade, I can identify as a kid. I wanted to camp in the backyard. My mom took us to, she took us camping every summer to all the national parks in the US. And I was just always this curious explorer that like wanted to see stuff and wanted to be outside. So that was a really driving motivation of curiosity. And you can look at through the arc of my career, choosing different sports, traveling all around the world, like shifting from mountain bike racing or paddling to mountain bike racing to rock climbing. All of that was really a curious exploration. I was never going to be the athlete who's going to do the 100-yard dash and just hone that in over and over again. I'm the athlete who wants to like see what's out there and explore. There was also, we grew up in a single parent, single mom, my sister and I, household, and my mom had to work really hard. And so what we saw, what she modeled for us was super hard work. She worked in the computer industry, so she was the only woman working in executive leadership in computers and tech. And so we saw someone really forging away, somebody working really hard, but that also meant that we were alone a lot. And so independence had to be developed, but also this modeling of super hard work. And I'm just going to say it too. We also saw that she had to work harder than the guys around her. And so my sister is a retired two-star general in the Air Force, so she's a pretty high achiever. And so that did really enforce this level of perfectionism in my sister and I, and hard work, but also feeling like we were going to have to do more if we wanted to get somewhere. in, men's sports fields, in the military, that we were going to have to work harder.
Did your mom talk about that, or did you
No.
just recognize that?
I I didn't recognize it at the time. Really only the last couple years of like some intensive therapy and post-concussion symptom recovery. I'm actually really looking at and starting to understand my childhood. So no, she didn't talk about it. I didn't recognize it probably until recently. And she just passed away unexpectedly a few weeks ago. And so I've really been reflecting on, what did my mom teach me? Verbal, nonverbal, and a lot of it was nonverbal. It was just modeled through action.
Mm.
Yeah.
Say more. I'm so intrigued right now because I just know environment has such an impact, and by the way, condolences to you, and your family. We were going to record very, I think within a day or so of when she passed. And so anyway,
Yeah.
thank you again. But say more about that. So as you've reflected, you mentioned you've been in therapy. As you reflect back on that time with your mom and life, what else have you learned? What else has been, I guess, gained by the reflection?
I think one of the big ones is for my sister and I, well, I won't speak for my sister, but for myself, I can recognize, and this sort of came also through the concussion recovery, that all of these accolades, these high achievements, like racing towards every single finish line, every summit, doing harder, bigger, faster things. All of those accolades for me, a lot of that is a substitute for attention and love and appreciation. And oh, you're good enough. If you win enough things, you're loved. And of course, I didn't couldn't articulate any of that, and it's not the only motivation for me to go climb these mountains and do these crazy things, but I can also see racking up all the wins and accolades, that is a substitute for being accepted and being good enough. And I think that probably comes from growing up alone a lot of the time. My sister and I were there, and so the way that you get celebrated is by doing great things and by winning. And this concept really became clear to me in the last few years of long-term post-concussive symptoms that you know basically stopped me in my tracks. I stopped being an athlete. I stopped racking up, impressive things or, doing crazy stuff. And I kind of, for a few years, didn't do much of anything except walk my dogs. And so all of a sudden it's like, well, if I'm not this amazing athlete who's motivating people and inspiring people, if I'm not that, then who am I? And so I really have been exploring my career. And I will say, I am proud of what I've achieved. All of those things are incredible. But, there's sort of a layering of like, they're part of something bigger, I guess. Is a
Okay,
good way to say
Rebecca. So I'm going to ask it. Let's take all the accolades aside then. Who is Rebecca Rusch?
I've been thinking a lot about this. I think all of us, what we have, and we all have a gift to share with the world, but really we're basically energy. We're energy. And so where I have the skill and expertise to put my energy is getting people outside, getting people moving, whether it's how many calories of goo to eat or grams of carbohydrate to go as fast as you want to go, or how to motivate, or why you should move at all, or why outdoors and movement are great for your mental health. So what I am is energy, and I can put it into the areas that I have expertise in. And so that expertise came from all those podiums and experience and navigating through the wilderness. And so taking all of those, lessons really from the trail, and giving them to other people, that is my role. That is starting to become more clear now.
It's amazing. The of the 5 S's, it's this serve component that's fascinating about getting to the point where we can take all that we've learned, all the struggle, all the stoke of victory, and now lift other people, to get where they are going. This idea of coaching and mentorship is a huge one. Spend a little more time on this concept of external reinforcement versus internal. And you've alluded to this, the head injury, concussive. We want you to tell that whole story, if you wouldn't mind, and dive into that and how the struggle of that has led to where you are, what you've just described now, kind of coaching and mentoring and doing those things. So dive into that for us.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a little about internal versus external, but it's, and I've talked a lot about external. Oh, you get sponsorship, you get accolades, you get to keep your job, as an athlete when you win things. Those are a lot of external motivators. But even if I go back to that kid who wanted to go camping in the summer at 6 years old, 5, 6, that kind of motivation is internal, of wanting to explore, and because I feel good outside. And cross country running, when I first got into that, was my first sport, and the feeling of just like running and sweating and doing something hard, like, was so exciting for me. So I mean, internal and external motivations, I feel like the internal ones have been fairly consistent throughout my life, and external ones are the ones that shift a little bit. And I love that you talked about, we talk about service, and it's kind of a natural thing that people want to give back, but, and everyone's like, oh, I don't know if I'm there in my career. Everyone knows the feeling of what it's like to, like, help somebody, whether you taught them to ride a bike, or whether you picked up a bag of groceries for somebody who was struggling. Everyone knows that little feeling, that, dopamine hit of like, oh, that felt good to do something nice for somebody else. So it's not a far reach at all that we all naturally want to do that. It's cool when a lot of athlete careers reach a point where, it shifts a little more to the giving side from the, personal wins. And you're still giving motivation, you're still giving inspiration. It's so important that competitive athletes are telling their stories, because that's the example to see what you can be. But at some point, an athlete career then does shift to a little more giving. I think that was really apparent to me when I launched Rebecca's Private Idaho, which is a premier gravel event in Idaho. This is going on year number 13. But like, standing at the finish line every year, like, I'm jumping up and down, I'm screaming as other people are finishing, I'm crying. We had like someone propose on the finish line. And, somebody's doing their first 100-miler ever. Like, that gives me such a high, just a bigger high than standing on my own podium. So it is a pretty cool feeling, and I'm excited for this part of my career. Pre-concussion, I probably wouldn't have said that, because I didn't have the awareness of, like, how could I take my energy and do something useful with it. So I'll go into the concussion story if that's what you want to do.
Yeah,
now.
please do pivot and go there. But I just want to stop and pause for our listeners to hear this. Rebecca just dropped the dopamine, right? Word. And we talk about the daily dose all the time, right? The D in dose is dopamine. The O, you were on Rich Roll, and Rich Roll speaks of this often, with his guests, about the feel-good chemicals, and the O is oxytocin,
Yeah.
which is literally the feel good, serve other humans, like lift other people. You do get high, and it's comparable to a podium, but in an entirely different way. The high comes from seeing and lifting other people in their successes, and athletes can do that, right? I mean, it's been so cool. Some of our guests over the years, whether it's Keegan Swenson or others who have talked about, now they're kind of coaching others along the way, and the feel-good chemical that comes with that is so real. So thank you for dropping the dopamine word.
Well, and I love that you said it too, because we have the capacity to release all of these neurochemicals through our actions, which is really cool. It's like free drugs. All that it requires is the energy to give someone a hug. If you want oxytocin, pet your dog, go for a run. And so, that's a big part of why I want to get people moving. And, it is obviously physical health, but absolutely mental health as well, to get people moving outside. So I'm with you on the brain drugs and all that kind of stuff.
Well, it's such a part of your story. So go into the injury, because the injury in my mind, at least listening to some of the podcasts pre and post,
Mm.
I mean, your learning journey of what's going on in your own mind and brain has been incredible. I mean, you now
What
have a
I'm
you
gonna
have a
ask you.
PhD in brain science now.
Yeah, I was gonna before and after. Like, what are you seeing as a different vibe or a different tone?
Your inner peace is so apparent.
Mm.
You know, I mean, listening to Rich Roll, I even listened again, and I was almost in tears hearing your own self discovery because I think so many athletes get to this peak where they're like, I no longer have it.
Yeah.
And they lose that identity. And it feels like you hit maybe a plateau in this accident, but
Hmm.
in my head, you're going to the next Kilimanjaro
Yeah.
with your ability to lift other people to climb. Right. And
Thank
so, I mean, I've seen that
you.
part of the reason Preston and I are doing this today is because we've had our own summits. You know, I've had plenty in business and other things, and Preston has as well in his own successes, but there's an incredible high with doing what we're doing right now with Brainstoke. And it has nothing to do really with our wins, but encouraging other people, you know, to go and achieve their wins. So anyway, I've just felt that and heard that. And even in the words as you describe yourself, you know, and we'll get into maybe the glop and the, you know, the caterpillar and, you know, the butterfly, all of that stuff is just, it's beautiful. Your journey of struggle now is, in my opinion, it's more meaningful because of the struggle as opposed to all the podiums, right? I mean, it's almost like the exclamation needed to be an accident for you to be able to say, here's now where I am now. And there's just so much more learning that can be done post struggle, real struggle. I mean, not that
Yeah.
mountain biking, you know, hard courses aren't, but you faced an entirely different demon in the accident.
Yeah, and I will say, when people ask about doing hard things in sport, and my nickname's the Queen of Pain, and like I really do some crazy hard stuff. But quite honestly, all of that, chosen pain and suffering is the training ground for when we get to the true trauma that's going to happen in all of our lives, losing a loved one, getting an injury, or whatever. All of that, those 30 years of being out in the wilderness, navigating, getting lost, falling down, getting hurt, those were the practice times. That was the playing field for me to practice the skills for the concussion that came 3 years ago, and the really sort of bigger trauma. But we know, I have this thing I call the athlete operating system, where I feel like everything I need to know in life, and this is only coming to me recently, but I've learned it all on the trail, in sport, and that applies to any part of life. And so we know that in sports, growth comes from trauma, so to speak, of like, if you're doing intervals, you basically go beyond the point where you can sustain it and hurt yourself as hard as you can, and then you take a couple rest days, and then you come back a little bit stronger. So if you take that growth from trauma, or if you fail in a race, you learned more from that than the race where everything went perfectly. And so this concussion journey, recovery journey, you know yeah, it's been a trauma of removing my identity, physical and emotional. Because one, okay, I'm going to lose my job. People aren't going to, see me the way they saw me. What if I'm not an inspiration? Like, what am I going to do with my life? I might get fired. So there's financial worries. What if I'll never be the same again? So all this is going on, while at the same time, I stopped moving because I was getting headaches. I wasn't getting the right medical care. I wasn't getting help. And so there was this physical spiral that was happening at the same time of this sort of identity crisis and relationship crisis. And so, just to go back to some of the science, if you're used to being a lifelong athlete and moving all the time, and all of a sudden you go cold turkey, your body revolts. The hormone regulations, your digestion, your circulation, the way you're sleeping, your joints. So, I basically felt like I became this old woman. Like, I couldn't get out of bed, I couldn't move. I wasn't sleeping. So all of the things that perhaps were prompted by a head injury left untreated. And so then I didn't make the lifestyle adaptations I needed. And that spiraled me even longer down. So I know that by not moving and not being outside, along with not getting the right care, that extended what might have been a month or 2 month or 6 month recovery into 3 years, because I stopped moving. And so, yeah, there's that period of introspection has been really interesting. And it was really only about 6 months ago where I literally came out of hiding and started talking honestly about the injury. And that was with the Brainstorm podcast series that I released with Celine Yeager and Feisty Media. And we just did a 4-part series on my experience with the intention of helping other people navigate brain injury recovery more smoothly than I did. Because there's kind of a mental health crisis, a healthcare crisis in people with brain injury, because they're all different, we don't understand it, there's but there are, what I learned through the process are, there is good care out there, and if you know where to find it, that concussion is a recoverable injury in most cases. But I had to learn all that the hard way, so it was a rough 3 years. But to your point, it was probably a necessary thing that wasn't going to happen in my career, because I'm so stubborn and I would just keep going and going and going. It probably wasn't going to happen unless I got thrown on my head and physically stopped to sort of do this internal work.
Can you share a little bit about over the past 3 years, what would be your experience when you knew you wanted to get outside, and maybe you did get outside and you were trying to ride or run or do an activity and you just didn't feel it? You just didn't have it. What were you dealing with inside when you were having those kinds of experiences?
Yeah, and that's accurate. I was saying to myself in journal, like, who is this person? Like, I didn't recognize myself. My friends would be like, you need to go for a ride. I'm like, I know, but I don't want to. Like, I don't want to do it, and I don't know why. And so it was someone I didn't recognize. And I really had to go back to basics of, and then there's wrapped in, if I did get out for a ride, then there's all this judgment of like, I've lost all this fitness. This is my power. Like, I actually still to this day am not really using power meters or metrics, because I don't want to look at it right now, because I don't want to get myself down or have a comparison. I'm really reshaping, like, I know what hard feels like, after being an athlete. I know basically what this heart rate feels like or that perceived exertion feels like. So I've actually had to remove the technology for a little bit so that I don't self-judge, which is, it's kind of weird. But yeah, so during that really hard period, basically I didn't recognize myself, and neither did my family and my friends, and they didn't know what to do. And of course, I'm hiding this all from my sponsors and work and pretending like everything's okay.
For listeners, if you don't mind, Breck, I'm going to just jump in.
Please.
For a little context, I mean, Rebecca's riding at the top of her game. She's a Red Bull athlete, right? Everybody wants the Red Bull helmet, right? I mean, she was living that dream. So she's highly, highly sponsored individual, is in the, outback of Arizona, self-supported, mountain bike camp trip, crashes, has a head injury, finds her way back out of the wilderness somehow. I don't know if you remember any of that, but I had my own last head injury, several years ago, and drove myself from the ski resort to the ER. To this day, I don't remember for, several things that went on. So just for context and for our listeners, this is someone who's, again, highly sponsored and ends up in a position where now what do I do? Because my living at the highest level, your sponsors are now doing what? And what's your fear and mindset at that point in terms of how others are now viewing you and the fear of going public with the injury and what they could know or Or, I mean, there's a lot of risk there, right? To career.
Yeah, there was, which is why I hid for so long. Yeah, and you nailed it on the head. This is my how I make a living is doing work with partners, whether it's bike packing or product testimonials or whatever, or expeditions. So yeah, there's the financial worry of I'm gonna lose my job and I don't, what job can I get? And then there's also the identity part of it. Well, if I'm not an athlete, not only what job can I get, but if I'm not an athlete, then what value, what do I have to offer anyone? So that was really hard, and quite honestly, I came out sort of decided to tell the concussion story really at the prompting of my good friend Celine Yeager, who's a podcaster and writer, and she's the co-author of my book. We wrote 10 years ago, and she's a good friend, and she knew what was going on. And I basically just said, will you help me tell the story? I feel like people need to hear it. And I asked her about it and showed her the videos. We hadn't shown any of the videos of the crash because I just ran my camera while I was doing my own self rescue. And I ran it basically for rescue purposes. I was like speaking to the camera like another person, and I'm an EMT. And so I was like, okay, I think she's going into shock. And oh, okay, she's getting cold now. And so I did have cameras running. So the footage is actually really interesting. So I asked Celine what she thought. I showed her the footage, and she just called me right away. And she was like, this is gold. People need to hear your story. And I was scared of like, okay, I'm gonna be written off, I'm gonna whatever. But I trusted her, and she organizationally, and like I also was still struggling with a lot of my recovery, so screen time and all those things were really hard. So she came in and helped me, and also my business partner Era, who'd been holding up the business for a couple of years, and taking meetings for me and doing all this. Those two people were like, yeah, we'll help you. Let's tell this story. And so those four episodes of Brainstorm podcast, they're pretty raw
Yeah.
because my thoughts, like they're all jumbled. I mean, it's a great resource of here's what did and didn't work for me. And Celine did a lot of research, and we have a resource guidebook that we just give people for free to help somebody. But once I started talking about the story, it actually felt really good. And I was like, I had no choice. It was sort of like you're lost on the trail, you're laying down. I mean, middle of Alaska, you're lost. This has happened to me. What are you going to do? Sit there and freeze to death? Or are you going to just trudge forward, even if you don't know it's the right direction? And that's kind of where I came to with the long-term concussion symptoms. I'm like, if I don't do something, I'm going to die. And
Yeah.
so I started talking about it, and it became very therapeutic to actually put it out there and then hear other people say, this helped me. And so then that started to, again, feed that oxytocin, like, okay, my story's helping someone. Okay, they're helping me, like, get motivated again. And so it sort of began to spiral. And now what's happening is all of these really cool opportunities, new opportunities are coming because of the concussion and the mental health challenge that I went through. I'm actually collaborating with a super cool company called OnRise, and they do mental health support for collegiate and professional athletic teams, and they use athlete peer-to-peer support. And so I've taken a bunch of mental health training classes with them. And so all of this is coming from the concussion. This
Yeah.
conversation with you is coming from the head injury. And so there are a lot of really cool business, like a career transition that's happening because I hit my head and had to go through something really hard and had to learn about the brain
Yeah.
and the body and had to learn through personal experience.
In
Ye- Go ahead. Go
sorry,
ahead,
Tom.
Tom.
We're all curious.
Totally curious.
In hindsight, Rebecca, and I know there were sponsor implications, and which probably impacted a lot of your choices over the past 3 years, I would guess. But in hindsight, how would you do it different? Would you disclose it sooner? How might that have helped you overall?
Yeah, and I mean hindsight, it's like
It's not
it's like
fair. I know.
it's not fair. It's like looking at race tapes, but that's how we learn. And
Yeah.
so yeah, in hindsight, I would have gotten just from a medical standpoint, I would have gone to a concussion specialist much sooner and gotten like the proper care. Um, it might not have led me down this really introspective journey and struggle. Um, but anyone who hits their head needs to go get checked out and get care right away. I mean, that's what the resource guide is about. So I would have done that differently. That was a big mistake. I would have told my closer network sooner. And then, yeah, I would have told the public sooner. But the reason I didn't is, I'm the queen of pain. I'm
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
I'm this pro athlete. Like, I can't admit, and even to my family, I'm also raised, I'm my mother's daughter of hardworking, independent. You got this. Just keep pushing forward. Like we talked about how I was modeled as a child. That's what I learned is you just keep working.
Yeah.
And you just don't complain about it and you just keep pushing through and you don't ask for help. Like that's what I learned.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do differently is yes, there's a time to push forward and don't stop and all that, but that we need teammates along the way. When it is really hard, that we do need teammates. That's what I would do differently.
Yeah. Great insight. Thanks.
Rebecca, there's so much there that you just talked about. So I have to dive into this idea of transition. One of the things that you described in your discussion with Rich Roll was in the transition, you described wanting to have a second act of life that was more driven out of the feminine than what? I mean, you described, just dive into that a little bit more, because this idea of push through, be gritty, just kind of strong arm your way through it, just use your iron will to survive. I mean, that served you for so long. Why now do you have this idea that you want to approach life? And your descriptive word was feminine. And I've had my own thoughts about this in my own journey. Why that?
Yeah, and I mean the terms masculine, feminine, I will say are a little bit cliche and generic, and
Yeah.
it's not a gender, or it's like there's energy. Like I said, we're energy. Some people it can be described as a little bit more masculine energy, which is a little more hard charging, head down, and typically feminine is more communicative, a little softer. But like, yeah, people are some parts of all of those things, and so that might not be the best label. I've had actually people be like, "Ew, like feminine, masculine." I'm like, that's just a descriptor.
Sure.
But it's like hard charging versus, a little bit not softer, but it can be maybe in neuroscience, left brain versus right brain kind of a difference. And as I think back about my parents and how I grew up, I do feel like my mom had to, out of circumstance, had to embrace some of the more hard charging traits because of circumstance of life. I think, and that's what that part of me is really developed. My dad, from what I know from his stories, he was a musician and artist, lived out of his car like I did, a little bit, a different personality, a different set of DNA. And so that part of my DNA, also out of circumstance, because my dad died when I was 3, it didn't really get developed. And so this is kind of a part of my life of, okay, this hard charger part of me is really developed from my mom. I think they're more masculine traits, but came from my mom. And then now just sort of exploring more parts of myself, and the nice thing about shifting careers from competitive athlete to, athlete icon and storyteller is that I can let the guard down a little bit with the super hard charging, having to compete at the highest level. There sometimes isn't room for art and podcasts and all the other sorts of things. So it's actually circumstantially, but also an awareness that I'm excited to sort of lean into this like part of me that's always been there but is underdeveloped.
So awesome. I just love it. And when I alluded to hearing this tone change, this is what I'm referencing. The idea of you giving space to explore an entirely different part of you, when you're young. And I can see tons of young, girl and boy racers in their teens looking up to you and kind of learning to hard charge, right? To push through, to
Yeah.
get in the pain cave. And I mean, you were the pain woman for so long. So for you to say, I want to discover other parts of myself, I think that's really powerful for a lot of people who are looking for leadership, in others. I too went through a similar thing years ago. I was selling a company, and I remember thinking the day that I sold, sitting there, recognizing this moment in my life and asking the question, how did I get here? And as I made a list of all of the people who really helped me get there, it was overwhelmingly women.
Mm.
Yet I had been in business with men for a long time. But really, when I thought about the people who made the most difference, they were women. And so I made a promise that day, my second act of life, I really want to double down on who are the women leaders and what are those attributes that allowed them to do it and become who they are. And so when I heard you describe that you want your second act to be more tied to, even if it's not feminine per se in the traditional term sense of attributes, there's a lot of really tough women. My last business partner, one of them, was a woman who was incredibly tough because she had to be in a male-dominated financial world. I mean,
Yeah.
she killed it, absolutely killed it, but very impactful to me. So I just love that part of you and your own journey of kind of saying, hey, I've killed it in this other area, but I want to develop something that's underdeveloped and kind of lean into that, because that discovery there's so
Well,
much
I
more
I think
richness
that
about the Rebecca of the future than the past.
Well, and I love that you say that because look, I'm not alone. A lot of people in the sort of like highlighter of their career, they are hyper focused and they have to be. You have to be somewhat myopic on this is what I'm trying to achieve right now. And then you get that on your resume, you sell your company, you go through a space where no one can take that away from you. You have done those achievements. And so there's a shift in a lot of people's careers of you know being motivated by fear, like I've got to get this next job, I've got to get that next contract, I've got to get that next win. And then you reach the point where you're like, you feel safe, you're like, okay, I have this body of work. I think the sort of head injury and recovery period, it was like I can look now and say I have this body of work, I can shape that into something really cool that will be the next thing. During the concussion recovery, I couldn't see that because I could only see the loss of athlete. This thing has to die. And then I have to make up something totally new. That was my perception at the time of like, do I need to go back to school? Like, what am I going to do? And sort of the realization over that is no, you take your body of work and you sort of mold it and shape it like a piece of pottery, and you make it into something else, or the sort of typical caterpillar, butterfly, or snake shedding its skin. Like you don't kill the thing that was before. The DNA is still there. It gets shaped differently. So that's a concept now that I can look forward to what's next with that frame of reference. Whereas in the middle of the concussion recovery, I was like, the athlete in me is dead. So then what's left? And the athlete is still left. The athlete is still there. The explorer is still there. That little kid is still there who wants to go climb mountains and be outside. So that part is not dead. What is dead is the the fear of like, if I don't win this next thing, if I don't do this next thing, my career is going to be over, or I'm not going to get that contract. So it's the same thing, but totally different
Yeah.
motivational shift.
It's awesome.
I
What?
still have to hustle for contracts. I still am like trying to launch new business things. So I'm still having to
Yeah.
scrap and make something work. But I didn't have to start from scratch. I thought I was going to have to. I didn't have to kill the athlete in me.
It's amazing that principle, I mean, you started with this, you led with this, which was I chose to lean into doing good hurt. And I had built the ability, the muscle memory for years and years of choosing to lean into good hurt, so that when trauma came, when I didn't necessarily want it, but when it came, I was prepared to be able to address it. I had the muscle, I had the grit, the resilience, is the word of the day today, in our
Yeah.
society. So it is that the thing that you relied on to get you through the last 3
Eventually,
years?
yes. And that's why I'm calling it athlete operating system, because I had all these answers of like,
Yeah.
you do hard stuff, you get a coach, you ask for teammates. If you're injured, you get PT on it, you take rest days. So I had learned this whole concept for 30 decades. What I didn't know is that everything that the skill set I've learned applies to everything in life, and that I could use that model to be like, okay, I'm down in the dumps. I've got to call a coach. I've got to get a business. I've got to like put people on my team, and then I need a regimen, a daily, I need to be stretching. I need to work on my nutrition. I need to, so I started to finally, when the recovery started happening, one is when I admitted that I needed help. And then I started to make a plan just like an athlete would, and I started to chip away day by day, a little bit every day. And that's been a very slow shift, but now it's really starting to accelerate, which is really cool. So yes, I had all the tools. I just didn't know in my brain that I had all the tools I needed, that I'd been practicing my whole life.
Rebecca, can I want to, I don't want to skip over the Blood Road experience that you had, but I want to make sure we stay on this topic timeline that we're kind of following. Can you share a little bit about the Ho Chi Minh Trail,
Yeah.
why it was important to you, and maybe what you discovered there or what you're still trying to discover on that trail?
Yeah, that was an amazing expedition that I put together out of curiosity and in a way to take my career in athletics and navigating and doing big expeditions and put it towards a personal question that I'd always had of like, what was my dad like? What happened? You know, yeah, they didn't discover that he died that day until I don't know, 30 years
Yeah,
later,
I think
something
that's what
like
I
that.
heard. Yeah.
Yeah, so lots of questions from when I was a kid, and quite honestly, nobody really talked about the Vietnam American conflict, and as kids, you didn't really talk about death, and it was a different time, and so that sort of trauma and wound of losing my dad at a young age never really got addressed until I went and did this expedition, and because we were doing a film, I had a voice journal every day. I had to do an interview every day. Had to do writing journal was part of the creative director just said you have to do these things. And they interviewed my mom and my sister. And so finally our family was like talking about this huge traumatic experience that literally we had never really talked about as a family. And we're talking about it on film, you know, which in some ways was a little easier because I'm not sitting talking to my mom or my sister um, about how hard it was. I'm talking to a camera or I'm
Hmm.
talking to a director who doesn't have a family history with me. So that ride, that film, and then subsequently taking the film on tour and sharing it with people has been a real powerful lesson in communication and storytelling and talking about the hard things. It really was my first mental health, awareness month-long trip that I didn't really realize that was what was happening. But it was because we had to talk and we were documenting. I was learning about my dad, meeting friends of his, meeting people who served with him, and it was a really powerful experience for me personally, but then turning it into a purpose for my foundation, and then sharing the film alone has been super powerful and has gotten families to talk about the war and has gotten sons and daughters to talk and grandparents and yeah, so thank you for asking about that. That really was the pivotal point that has started
This,
this whole shift over the last decade.
I feel like there's a little bit of a theme there on what you just shared versus the concussion story. And a couple of the key points that I caught is when you open up and you share with others and you trust others, that's
Yeah.
that's part of the healing process of whatever type of trauma you might be dealing with.
Yeah, I love that you said trust. And quite honestly, we talked a little offline. I'm launching a new podcast called What's the Rush? And the whole concept of it is about shedding the armor, what the protective mechanism we put around ourselves that at some point doesn't really protect us. It actually hurts us by sort of I think of like something that would be hidden behind a scaffolding or like hidden behind an armor for a long time. All the soft material in there is going to get softer and softer and softer. And so, What's the Rush podcast is exactly about what if we just take off the shield we all put up in front of each other? What if we were just honest with each other, even super high achievers? And what if we just said, hey, that was hard for me, or that hurt my feelings? What if it just wasn't a big deal, to be honest?
Amen.
But we have a
Amen.
lot of other factors, external factors that force us to kind of have that force shield. And once we take it down, we actually and take the armor off, we feel quite a lot lighter, and it surprisingly feels easier.
If you could go back now, when you think about, was the term the athlete operating system? Was that?
Yeah, that's my term that I made up for this concept. Yes.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I really do. But if you think about, I mean, you spent years and years building armor,
Yeah.
right? So how would you do it over? What would the athlete operating system now be so that it's not so much armor externally, but you have this internal strength too? I mean, how do you get that kind of external armor built to be successful out in the world, racing, doing all the stuff you've done, and yet not necessarily, I guess, ignore these other
Yeah.
pieces, that
Yeah.
that weren't built.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to protect our little soft underbelly, and we can't just totally expose ourselves. Or, if you take nature, for example, a wild animal, they have to protect themselves. They have to run fast. They have to, be able to survive. And so I think of the armor, that I built over the years, all of the physical armor for sure, which that's great. We're building strength, mobility, you know, the healthy physical part of being an athlete your whole life. Um, I think emotional armor is a whole nother concept. And maybe it's a little bit more of a porous shield where, things like social media or people throwing shade at you that just doesn't really matter, or even others people's opinion you don't care about, doesn't need to come through maybe the mesh. But the sort of the mesh could flow with like you being honest or with people that you feel safe with and that you care about. There is no armor. But yeah, does that make sense? So
It does. I'm just trying to
yeah.
apply that, when I think through all of the external muscle that it takes to do all that you've accomplished. You would no more, ignore training days in an effort to go race as you would, if you ignore your emotional endurance by just burying it or ignoring
Yeah.
it or just not addressing it, then you're not exercising, the emotional muscle that is needed for, the emotional endurance of life. So when you
Yeah.
look back on, going through, maybe it's the brain injury phase, was there emotional endurance that you leaned on or that you pulled from?
Yeah, so I'm gonna just go back for 1 second. What I would shift, and this is a really simple way to explain it, is instead of an armor, you'd be developing your strength. And, physical strength, like you said, for training, and your mental health strength, your emotional strength, which often athletes, people in general, are not practicing. They're not meditating, or they really feel like they should meditate, and I do it every once in a while, or they're not seeing a therapist, or they're not journaling. So yeah, if we aren't practicing that sort of emotional, or they're not communicating, non-judgmentally with their spouse or whoever. So there is emotional strength that if you develop in that way, you don't need the armor because you actually have the emotional strength to sort of withstand. whatever. So it isn't armor anymore. It's actually strength is the best way I would explain it.
It's good.
Rebecca, so you've been known as the Queen of Pain.
Hmm.
What are you now? The Queen of what?
I was thinking of that if I like think of some little nickname and yeah. Yeah, I actually just reread Dan Millman's book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, which is a classic. I read it a
Yeah.
long time ago. And I just kept thinking about the whole time I was reading that, the way of the playful warrior, and I'm like, maybe I'm the queen of playful sorry, the way of the purposeful playful warrior. But then I was like, maybe I'm the queen of purposeful play. Like, what if we turned training and all this stuff just into recess for adults and play, and which, if I go back to, it's partially why I'm not using my power meter and some of those other things, because I want to shift the mentality from like this is going hard, I'm having fun, and I'm not worried about what watts I'm putting, but it feels good to go hard. And so maybe it's the queen of purposeful play. I don't know.
Yeah, no, hey, I like it. I can embrace it. It reminds me of I don't know if you know of Dr. David Spindler, but he talks of happy watts, right?
Yeah.
And I think this kind of embraces that same concept of happy watts. Is the better attitude you have, the happier you are, the more you'll be successful.
Or your dog. Like, I have my dog in training, and the dog trainer's like, when you play with him, he's releasing the same kind of neurochemicals as you are. And so he's like, the dogs have it right. The dog's not sitting there going, I mean, maybe if you got an older dog, but generally a young dog, you open the door and they're like, pew, yes, they want to go out and play. So
Yeah.
what if, yeah, I try to take lessons from my dog sometimes.
I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yesterday Preston and I rode 3 hours. We had this window of good weather. Went out with some friends for 3 hours on a ride, and I have to admit, I smiled the whole 3 hours, and it hurt. All the bad dessert choices all just surfaced on that 3 hour ride, but it was just fun to be outside, and that's why Brainstoke was born. It feels good to go out and to get the serotonin stoke, in our lives. And so I think play is awesome. So I want you to take whatever amount of time, if you were to just be on the TED Talk stage today, how would you like to wrap up? Freestyle any way, whether it's speaking about what's important to you, passionate, people who have had an impact on your life. Go for it. Whatever you want to take it.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, you brought up TED Talk, so I will say, right after I did Blood Road, I did my first TEDx, and I called it Navigating Home. And much of the theme of that was that what I was looking for was not going to be in this country or on that podium. That a sense of safety and home comes from within. And I actually gave that talk, 9 years ago, and so I would, that launched this kind of journey of introspection. But what's so cool about that is that once you're strong on the inside, you actually start to share it on the outside. And so I am a big advocate of people moving in nature and getting outside, because that hits a lot of all the physical and mental health boxes of community and hard work and, circulation. And so I'm big on that mission of getting more people either inspired or giving them the education or the place to do it, or to get outside and move and be in nature, or to plan their own adventure. So that's a big purpose of mine. I actually just went through, if you know who Michael Gervais is, he's a Finding Mastery and sports psychologist, great guy. I went through one of his short sessions on writing a purpose statement. And what I came up with from that was basically an invitation. And I wrote, after 7 days of like looking at values and all this, came up with the phrase, let's explore within and without. And so continuing to take myself exploring and bringing other people along with me on the internal journey, but also the external journey. And so that is a lot about where my work is going, is planning some cool adventures for 2025 for myself, but bringing other people along with What's the Rush podcast, with some more writing, and collaborating with some other groups that are doing really cool things, like hopefully Finding Mastery and On Rise and all that. So that's where I'm at. And yeah, I do invite people to come along for the podcast ride, but also some of the other stuff, because I don't want to do it alone. It's more fun in a team.
What's the Rush is going to be so powerful. I think that's you have such an incredible platform. You really do. I mean, I'm sure it's been hard, the journey, just the changing and, transformation, but I think your impact is going to be exponentially larger because of how real your own struggle in this last phase has been. It's a beautiful story.
Thank you for saying that. It makes my hands sweat. It makes me get excited. Like, that's how I know it's a fun adventure, because it's like, I can feel it. And thank you for saying that. And Rich Roll also said the same thing. And I really listened, that like, hey, maybe this is going to be a bigger impact, is the stuff you'll do next.
So that first podcast is, I think, February 19th. Is that when it goes live? February 19th?
February 19th,
Okay.
we go live with Michael Gervais. He's helping me kick it off.
Okay, well, good. I think our podcast, this will go live about a week in advance. So good timing. You bet. Yeah.
Well, and I really appreciate that you were born on a bike ride, and the conversations you're having, and, the same motivation to get people moving and thinking and exploring. So I feel like we're really aligned in our purpose.
It's awesome. There's healing in it for sure. Those pedals, somehow they just soothe the soul. So, Rebecca, thank you again. It's been a pleasure having you on. And yeah, we're stoked for whatever happens next.
Well, I hope you'll come visit me at Rebecca's Private Idaho, and we can our next meeting can be in person on a bike ride.
I will be there. I can promise that. It's already on my calendar. So
Thanks again. You've had your daily dose.
Thank you.